Welcome to We Rise podcast.
Hey, thanks so much. Great to be with you. And well, I love seeing that picture and being being reminded that you weren't always old. Uh, no, but one thing about it, you haven't lost any of your steam or vim and vigor, and that's great. And one of the things that I just got to say that one of the things that I've always admired so much about you and been honored if you ever anytime you ever acknowledged knowing me and knowing my organization Numbers USA is that your message has always been, as you said, you are not anti any type of group, and neither are we. But boy, as I just spent 320 pages of this new book saying, immigration, not immigrants particularly, but immigration, high immigration, immigration surges, mass immigration, uncontrolled immigration has just had a brutal effect on African Americans. The freed slave, it kept the freed slaves, most of them from rising. It kept their children and their grandchildren, and it's having the same effect today. So it's that's there we have to, as a nation, say to ourselves, why are any groups put ahead of African Americans, the people who are the descendants not only of slavery but the descendants of Jim Crow, all the things that have happened in the past, and as we'll discuss, I'm sure that mass immigration, not moderated immigration, but mass immigration is it's most of the time I don't think intentional, but sometimes it is intentional way to bypass the needs of the African American population.
I think most of the time, Roy, it is intentional. I think as I have read your book and as I have experienced what's going on in my community, we see it becoming the politics of survival for many institutions and individuals. We see the benefits from their coming, making others more powerful. So let's talk a little bit, real quick, for me, about what's going on at the southern border. I think that's really more important than Black Lives Matter. It's more important than critical race theory. It's more important than Build Back Better. Because when we come out of COVID-19 and begin to adapt to the new norm, we've got to deal with the fact of the hundreds of thousands of people who have come into this community called the United States of America since the COVID process has been in place. So what kind of impact is that going to have on the progress that we think we're going to make?
Yeah, the number one thing that we always look at is that when people come across the border, most of them come across to work, to gain jobs in the United States, to make the larger wages. A lot of the wages they make don't look all that attractive to Americans, but they're very attractive, people coming in across the border. And the thing is so disturbing to me is that a good share of these people, the hundreds of thousands, maybe, we're talking about well over 1 million in this last year, who come across the border. They're being given work permits. It's bad enough to have them come in and be a part of the illegal labor force, but a good share of them our government's giving them work permits, which they're allowed to have and keep until they're either turned down, until they're turned down by a court, and often that can take several years. There's such a backlog. So, why wouldn't you make a false claim of asylum, for example, if you know you're going to get a work permit that you can keep until you have to show up for a court hearing several years later, and then maybe you just bypass it, and then at that point enter the illegal economy. So we're talking about people who are directly competing in quite a number of the job occupations, mostly at the lower and middle levels. By the way, as you know, Will, my book is primarily concerned about the 2/3 of Americans that don't have a college degree. That doesn't mean that mass immigration does not have an impact on the ability for upward mobility that happens through getting a college degree and all of that. But I really feel that our economy has mostly badly let down the 2/3 of Americans who don't have a college degree. And so when I focus on the African American population, that's the population I'm focusing on. And it's the Americans without a college degree who have to compete so directly with most of these illegal aliens and asylum seekers, most of whom are fraudulent asylum seekers. My goodness, actually, what's happening right now, I think, is to the country is very similar to what happened to Miami in the Mariel boat lift.
Mhm.
Circumstances aren't exactly the same. I'm not trying to say that, but the fact is that you had a situation where you just had a massive change overnight, and there have been a lot of studies, and a lot of people have tried to prove that it really didn't have that much of effect. But George Borjas, Harvard economics professor, has done a lot of study on that. And he, during the 80s, during the first part of your work, he wasn't sure. He couldn't find the data to prove that, what you were thinking was true, that it really was having a big effect on wages and overall wages and employment opportunities. But then, see, a lot of data really trails experience, doesn't it?
Yes.
You were experiencing, and of course, you had the job of witnessing, analyzing. You were experiencing it firsthand. The economists and all of the prognosticators, they were waiting on data, which sometimes took several years. But finally, Professor Borjas, after 1990, the data came available that he was able to fully assess the situation. And I'm saying this for the benefit of your audience because you know far more about this than I do. But that's at the point that he found, oh my goodness, this was an absolute shock, economic shock to the workers of Miami, the workers who did not have college degrees, and particularly to workers who did not have a high school degree, the high school diploma. And of course, I know that you and the people you work with work hard to get people as much education as they can. But I've had a real appreciation over the years, Will, that um, not every American has they can have all kinds of native instincts. They can develop great skills, but they may not have that kind of temperament for high school. And so if people don't make it through high school, should we punish them by giving the jobs away that they could take, and instead giving away to people from other countries? It seems like a cruel way for our government to punish people who don't finish high school. And of course, this is punishing people who finish high school and don't go to college. So what you experienced in Miami in the 80s, this last year is really threatened job markets in many places across the country in a not quite as heavy a way because it's being dispersed. But this is one of the reasons why that the Democratic congressmen, Hispanic congressmen that are on the Texas border, they've spoken out all last year that the federal government is not protecting them and protecting their communities, because those communities, which are primarily Hispanic, this is a tremendous blow to the jobs, to wages, and also to social services. Of course, it moves on into other communities, and when it gets to the cities, it's the African Americans that take it the worst.
No doubt. One of the biggest obvious impacts we can see every day. When I came here, every sky cap at the airport was black. When I came here, the overwhelming majority of those who were in the service industry and the 220,000 restaurant seats were black. When I came here, the longshoremen were black. Cleve Turner was the head. You fast forward to 2021, and you will see that all that has changed. When I came here, some of the most successful, rich, colored people were yardsmen. They kept the lawns up from South Beach to North Beach. All of that has changed. So it concerns me that now we're getting ready to repeat that in a worse sense, that we're going to let all these people in with a work permit, and there will be more displacement. Just as we began to make some kind of progress in the 60s, this happened. So what should be our message to those who are making those decisions in Washington?
Well, one of the things I say in my book is toward the end is that one federal commission after another, beginning in the 1970s, an academic commission after another, have said that mass immigration that was restarted in 1965 and then made much worse in 1990, that mass immigration is retarding and even setting back the economic progress that African Americans had made in the 1950s and 1960s.
Not racism?
Well, racism, and
it's not racism.
But
So
racism is a part of it because, as I talk in the book, there's just no doubt that there is an employer bias. That if the line can be filled long enough with non-African Americans, that in general, employers, sadly, prefer the non-African American, and they especially go after immigrants, and they even immigrants from Africa. So in that sense, it may not be so much race as it is. It's more of a racial, cultural bias against African Americans that have an American culture, and that frankly, that want to live and work and be paid like Americans. So they prefer immigrants who aren't used to that. The children of immigrants, they also want to be paid and work and live like Americans. But the immigrants will accept something less. So yes, but what these commissions, one after another, said, this is setting back the progress. And the numerical level of immigration, first of all, needs to be pulled back. It needs to be moderated. Now, that was the decision of the Rockefeller Commission, bipartisan commission, in 1972 or 1973. It was the recommendation, the findings of the Hesburgh Commission, federal bipartisan commission, in 1980. It was the conclusion of the American Academy of Sciences in a big report on race. And at that time, what was that? Would that have been 50 years after Myrtle's big book on what needed to be done on racial progress? Anyway, that was American Academy of Science. They said the same thing. And then in 1993 to 1996, there was the bipartisan commission on immigration reform that was led by Barbara Jordan.
Yes,
they had the same conclusion. So, it's kind of like somebody coming to the door of somebody that, say, a rural farm, and saying, there's a bunch of bandits that are over 5 hills over. They're on their way, and you ignore them, and then you ignore another when somebody keeps warning you. And then the thing is that the bandits come and they rob you of your livelihood. They rob you of your wealth. That's what one Congress after another. And it doesn't matter whether Congress has been run by Republicans or Democrats, whether the president was Republican or Democrat. The fact is, the federal government has ignored every one of these warnings, and every one of the warnings has come true. They said it's going to get worse. And, I think many people are familiar that the median household wealth of Black households
Mm.
is generally has been for a couple of decades now, 10, let me say this another way. The median household wealth of the white household is 10 to 12 times higher than the median household wealth of Black households.
Say
Now,
that again, Roy, because I want folks to hear that.
yeah.
In 2021,
So that's generally it's been 10 to 12 times. However, in the fall of 2020, just before I started writing this book, and this is one of the reasons I decided, you know what, I need to write this book, is that in October 2020, admittedly, this is affected by the pandemic, but they found that the average Black household, no, the median Black household had less than 6% the wealth, the assets, the net assets, the wealth of the median white household. Less than 6%. That's an 18-to-1 racial wealth disparity. That's so it was bumped up even from the 10 to 12, which was shameful. But by then it's there. I don't know. I haven't seen a new report this year, but so that means half of all Black households have assets of less than $10,000 net assets, and half of them have more. Half of all white households have net assets below 170,000. Half of them have more. Now, the problem though is not that white households have been getting rich, because that the average white workers, white households that don't have a college degree have been losing real income over the last 40 years of high immigration. High immigration has hurt every race, every ethnicity that doesn't have a college degree, but it's hurt African Americans more, and hence, and it is and there are a higher percentage of whites have college degrees than Black households, and that's another reason, because college degree households have done better. So mass immigration is something that tends to give more to those who have and take from those who have less. It is a form of a form of government theft.
we believe that it's mass immigration that has us in the position that we're in. It's not Black Lives Matter. It's not critical race theory. It's not Build Back America. It's not John Lewis Voters' Rights Act. It's about the fact that I've got something called the Legislative Black Caucus in Washington, D.C., that will not meet this issue of immigration head on. So we keep diverting from the real problem in the name of satisfying those who are part of creating the problem. What should be our message to the Congressional Black Caucus?
Well, I think one of the problems and why the Congressional Black Caucus has ignored this harm to African American communities in the same way that all the other racial groups in Congress have ignored them is that I haven't looked recently, but something approaching half or maybe more than half of the Congressional Black Caucus represent districts that are heavily Hispanic and other immigrant, and so their feeling is that they're not there primarily to represent the interests of African Americans, but to represent the interests of this wider group. And so there's a lot of and the typical African American member of Congress represents a higher percentage of immigrants than say the white representatives do. So you could say it's a little sense of divided loyalty, but I think the message that has to go to them is every form of mass immigration that harms the opportunity for African Americans also harms opportunities for the legal immigrants that are already here. That's one of the things that I show over and over in my book. And which this is not. This gets right back to your point. Well, we're in this together, and so uh, the crazy thing is that too many people are making decisions that African Americans have to be held down in order to help Hispanics and other immigrant groups. No, this is hurting other immigrant groups. It's a question of, are you going to, if you're concerned about immigrants, are you going to hurt the immigrants who are already here for the sake of bringing in more immigrants? Or are you going to bring in fewer immigrants, help the immigrants who are already here, and stop hurting the African Americans who have roots in this country? What are we talking about now? 15 to 18 generations that most African Americans have roots in this country, and that a country that says it wants to square off some of the problems that happened from slavery and Jim Crow and all of those things, and yet we have a federal government. So I think the message has to be to the Congressional Black Caucus. It really is primarily, look, you're not helping the immigrants who are already here by bringing in more immigrants. And why don't you help all of us and pay attention to what mass immigration has always done to the African American community?
So we're on the right track when we, in our We Rise initiative to change the educational outcomes in Liberty City, to have partnership with the Hispanic community to make sure as we take this voice to the powers to be, that we take this voice colorless, that we take this voice to the powers to be, because we have people who are in part of this solution who do not look like each other, but they have the same kind of predicament in this country. And I think that's an important move for us as we go forward.
Yeah, it is powerful. And, the term, some people say this sounds wonky, but it's not very wonky. I think the average person can figure this thing out pretty quickly. Tight labor versus loose labor. That's what all of this is about. It's a fundamental economic thing that people at whatever education level or place in life can understand. Do we want tighter labor markets where those who are selling their labor have a better chance, or we want a little looser labor market where those who are selling their labor are at a disadvantage? It's a supply and demand issue. Now we see right now, because of COVID and other things going on right now, we actually have a tight labor market. Now we've got gigantic quantities of Americans who aren't working and who need to work, but for one reason or another, it may be uncertainty about the safety of going back to work with the virus going on. It may be some other things, but in the end, eventually millions more people need to get back to work. But right now we've got a tight labor market, and what's happening around the country? Employers are raising the wages, and that's what happens in a tight labor market. Mass immigration is about loosening the labor market. It always has been, and as I show in the book, and basically, look, I'm not an economist, but I pulled together a number of, I think, just great economic studies and histories, and the economic historians that are seen as being the preeminent economic historians of this country, especially on the question of economic inequality. What they say and have said in a book that came out in 2016 is that in this country, every time that immigration levels rose significantly, inequality grew. Every time immigration was reduced significantly, inequality shrank.
Say that again, Roy. Say that again.
Every time that this country had a significant increase in immigration numbers, inequality grew.
Yes.
Every time that, for one reason or another, there were significant reductions in immigration, inequality narrowed. There was more equality in the country, and the people, most vulnerable people, the people with less education, fewer skills, life has handed them some tough things. Life got better for them, and they actually gained on people at the top. So we are in a period of 40 years more than 40 years well, 40 years of very high immigration and really 55 years of mass immigration. So it's not surprising that our country has become more and more divided and unequal in our economics. And the story that, and here's another thing. And if not just members of Black Caucus, but you would think that they would want to know, wouldn't you?
I would think so.
But any member of the Congress is to have them spend 15 minutes going over what happened between 1924 and 1965, and or to read that. There's 3 chapters in my book. All your listeners know about the Great Migration, and most people know that when African Americans, 90% of whom were still in the South and
Yes.
still probably working on or near the plantations where their ancestors had been enslaved, when they were able to get jobs in the North and the West, things changed. And that Great Migration began in the World War I, whenever it cut off the international immigration. And then once the war was over, we had high immigration again. But in 1924, Congress didn't cut off immigration, but they cut it back by about 3/4. They moderated it. And immediately, African-American newspapers began reporting. I mean, within a year, they were reporting that the economic status of African-Americans was improving. Wages were employment's going up, wages are going up, ability to climb ladders are going up. Now, from 1924 to 1965, we were averaging 200,000 immigrants a year. 65, it quickly went up to 300,000 and 400,000. Since 1990, it's been over 1 million a year. Legal immigrants, not even counting illegal. Now,
With a work permit?
no, I'm saying, yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. Interestingly enough, under the law, the people who are given work permits at the border when they are still considered to be illegal aliens. That's interesting. Illegal aliens who have work permits from the federal government. But I want your viewers to keep this in mind, that the industrialists of the North, the industrialists of the West, they didn't need black labor from 1880 to 1924 because it was all their extra labor needs were provided by the great wave of immigration. But boy, when the foreign immigration was cut off, what did they do? Well, the historians tell us they sent labor contractors, recruiters all over the South. They'd go into the fields, they'd go into people's homes, they would buy them train tickets, they would set them up. Isabel Wilkerson's great book, Warmth of Other Suns, that came out about 10 years ago, interviews these people. But it's an amazing thing because the North was opening up, the jobs were opening up. And as that opened up, jobs in the South got better, wages got better. Now, Jim Crow kept on for a while, but in my book, I report on the historians who say that the civil rights movement could not have culminated as quickly as it did in the 1960s without the Great Wave. You had to have the Great Wave in which African Americans were not bound to just a small part of the country, and because of that, wages went up. And and I'll step back here, Will. I'm sorry, I'm filibustering, but this period, people need to realize this, that the descendants of slaves they were semi-slaves, most of them, from the end of the Civil War till 1924. And yet, from 1924 to 1965, white workers saw their real income go up 250%, and black workers saw their real income go up 400%. Got that? It went from a little over double for whites to 4 times blacks. That's what happened when African Americans were able to show what they could do in industry, finally. And then in 1965, Congress restarted mass immigration, and the black underclass, the black working class has been stalled ever since.
And in 1965, we were demonstrating, we were protesting for equal rights. And as we demonstrated and protested, Congress was passing another law that would put us back in our place.
A month apart.
Yes.
This 1965 Voting Rights Act was in August, and then in 1965, I mean, in September 1965, they restarted mass immigration. Frankly, I don't think it really does not look like anybody was paying attention, but they did pay within 7 years. A federal commission looked it over and says they were paying attention. They said that was a mistake. We should not have we didn't mean, Congress says they didn't mean to restart mass immigration, but they did. It's harmful. And they had a special section on how harmful it was to the progress for African Americans, for what was trying to be done to civil rights. So it is, boy, Will, I'm glad you brought up that. I mean, it's a horrible juxtaposition, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
August to September, all that promise in August, and in September just took it right back.
We were marching, we were demonstrating, we were protesting. We thought we had it made, and then all of a sudden, there was a new rule. And when the new rule came into place, we reverted back to blaming everything on racism. And it's very difficult in 2022 to be competitive when you are competing against one who has a work permit and you just got your stimulus check.
Yeah.
Tough decision. So I think it's part of a conspiracy to keep us in our place.
Well, and look, here's my.
Well, you don't have to worry about it. I can say that right. That's okay.
Well, I'm we all have our biases. We have our top priorities. I'll tell you what, my top priority is I believe in jobs. I believe in work. I do not believe that you are being kind to a person to say we're not going to encourage you to work. In fact, we're going to give your jobs to somebody else, but we will try to create as large of a safety net as possible for you. I think it's cruel, and I think it's that a significant portion of the people who push this high immigration, they've made the decision that the black underclass is not capable of doing jobs, of producing, of being productive members of society. That's racism.
And those of us who say that they made the decision simply because of the race, that's racism also. If those of us who know that that is not the case and don't speak up against that, then that is racism also. So too often, those who are in power to tell the truth, as you and I are trying to tell the truth, won't tell the truth. Then those who lie, it becomes the truth.
Hmm. And this has been 40 years of people who make money from mass immigration.
Yes.
Who gain power through mass immigration. They are doing this for very selfish purposes, but they have put on the mantle, they've wrapped themselves in the robe of anti-racism. If you are against what we're doing, not what they're doing for selfish purposes, but they won't say it's selfish. You are racist. And that scared a lot of people away. A lot of people who kind of know better have been afraid to take this on because they're going to be called a name. But it's extraordinary that mass immigration, unfettered immigration, that has been so harmful to the African American community, but also to recent immigrants, can be that if you try to correct that somehow or another that's supposed to be racist. So we have to be bold and brave. Willard's not, over the last 30 years, there's not been very many people standing with you. I do want to correct the record a little bit. Maybe my memory's failing me, but I believe you mentored me. But but I've been very, very happy to have had the relationship and to learn from you. to watch people, and there are, and you're not the only one, but there are people who have just been in the trenches fighting against the tide. This is a hard wind, harsh wind that's blowing against, what did you call it? A wind that tries to stifle every bit of progress you're trying to make. I think that was a good word, stifling. And in some ways, it's almost like with this harsh wind of mass immigration, those of you who are trying to correct these various problems, sometimes the best you can hope for is to keep things from getting worse faster.
I think that's true, but I think also we must possess the courage to do and say the things that need to be said and done. When I was at the parade yesterday and they were talking about Martin's dream, it was a disaster. It was a nightmare because we have not made any significant group progress since Martin had his dream. The things that he articulated are not a reality to the masses of us. And I think it's, once again, we have been duped into believing that everything that creates the conditions that we're in is because some white people who don't like black people, or some Cubans who don't like black people, or it's always somebody else's fault. I think we know, based on this conversation and your book, that the solution is much greater than that, and it's also greatly simple.
It is simple, isn't it?
Things that we ought to pay attention to and be bold enough and brave enough to challenge those things in spite of what people believe. I believe, once again, that all of our problems rest with us. I believe that one of the greatest contributors in 2022 to our problems is not racism. It's not critical race theory. It's the fact that we have allowed ourselves to believe that certain things that are our realities are born and birthed by somebody else. And I think the greatest contributor is in your book. And one of the things I want to do, I want 50 copies of your book because I want to make sure that all of my staff and all Black elected officials in Dade County get a copy of your book so they can see that the real solution to where we are is about our attitude about what we're going to do with our own life. That we keep getting duped about the fact that it's racism. We keep having this whole feeling of victimization that it's somebody else's fault. But when you allow millions of people to come in through the southern border and give them a work permit, do you think that we are going to make any significant progress in the labor market under those kinds of circumstances against those kinds of competitors? I don't think so. And when that happens, then somebody tells us that it's not because of the work permit, it's not because of the special privileges given to those new persons, it's because it's racism. Well, if it's racism, then it's racism, but you got to show me that. I don't think it is. I think that your book points out clearly what the solution is. And I think part of our responsibility is to challenge those who are in the trenches, who can make the contribution, to be brave enough, to care enough to say that this is the real solution. So I'm going to take 50 copies of your book, and I'm going to make sure that all of my staff and all of my board members and all Black elected officials understand that it ain't racism, it ain't victimization, it's not critical race theory. It's the fact that we have some institutional things that are going on in this community, and unless we challenge them, then we pass on to the next generation that things that used to be a dream are still a nightmare. So I think your book really lays it out. And I've read a lot of books about this stuff, as you well know. I tried to have my own campaign. I came to Washington, conducted the campaign, had billboards up all throughout Washington saying the impact of illegal immigration, that legal immigration was adversely impacting on the progress of Blacks and the whole 9 yards. Had a big luncheon, had Tony Brown to come in and speak about the impact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And did my first YouTube with you, because you put me on YouTube.
That's right.
Before it became the popular thing to do. And I was all over the country talking about the impact of legal and illegal immigration on the progress of Black folks. That still is a major problem. That still is a problem that we have to face up to. There still is a problem that we know is not going to go away until we admit that it's got to be us doing what we've got to do, saying what we've got to say. So I'm going to be challenging all Black elected officials, all of my friends who understand that they really want to solve this problem, to get a copy of your book and become as vocal as you and I have been.
I appreciate that very much. And look, it's very arrogant to say, but I believe it's important.
It's most important. I think this book is validation of everything that I was saying back in the 80s, and now I have it on your authority.
Here.
It's the real stuff.
There you
it's
go.
Not by Muhammad Ali. It's not by Malcolm X. It's by Roy Beck, who cannot pass for being Black, who can never be accused of being anti-white folks.
Well, that's right. And I would say something to back up on the people not giving up. The stories, the 200-year story I tell is, of course, not something that I found from primary research. What I did is I read lots and lots of books in which this was a paragraph in a book or a page in a book, but it hasn't been pulled together to tell a whole narrative story. And when you see that what was happening to Frederick Douglass in the 1830s,
mm-hmm.
how similar it is to today, how similar it is to what was happening to African Americans in the 1980s, and then in the early 1900s, to read how W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about the same thing you were just talking about, how they said, well, 10 years ago, the top jobs and the restaurants and the hotels, and he said, it's the same thing you were just talking about. He says they were African Americans.
Absolutely.
He says now they're Italians and this, that, and the other thing. Immigrants that have come in. What some people told me about reading the book is, it's not so much that any individual story is so shocking. It's so shocking that the same thing has happened over and over and over again.
Yes.
But
yes.
Here's the thing. What I hope is that African Americans, and but I would hope that African Americans who feel like there's just no chance to sort of break out into the jobs market, is if they look at these stories and realize how hard it was for African Americans at these other parts of history, and just the courage that it took to break through in those parts of history, and then to realize that every time the labor market tightened up, African Americans showed that they absolutely had the ability to compete. There's W.E.B. Du Bois, again, mentioning him, about 8 years or 5 years after the 1924 Act, he said that perhaps the greatest thing that ever happened to the African American worker was the slowdown of bringing white workers from Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And the newspapers, African American newspapers, said, well, before they cut off immigration, the general attitude was there was just something almost biological about African Americans that they couldn't really succeed in the modern industrial society, right? I mean, it's that, but okay. But then they said, but then when the labor market tightened, and even though they'd been blocked from the industrial jobs for a half century, all of a sudden they were in the jobs and they flourished. So, right now it just seems so silly to think about that. But, there were these racial attitudes at the time that people just thought, well, I just think that there's just something that African Americans don't have. They can't do it. No, they could. They just didn't have a tight enough labor market. And so there's, throughout this history of this book, that's in this book, I think should be an encouragement, or I should say a discouragement from people to give up. And as you say, make excuses. On the other hand, my message to the general public, particularly to the white majority and to the 1/3 of Americans who have college degrees, is let's honor the work of the other 2/3 of all races, and let's stop making their life harder. Let's show some respect. And so we have a job. Those of us who have college degrees and are better off, we have a responsibility to take away that barrier. That's the message on the other side. While you're telling people don't give up and don't have excuses.
Well, people who listen to me are not going to give up. What has to happen is that all of us who have listening audiences must be singing the same song. And that's why it's important that Frederica Wilson, who is my congressperson, that's why it's important that all my state legislators, that's why it's important all of us who have influence and access to those who make decisions begin to have a consistency about what is the solution to the problems that we find ourselves dealing with in 2022. And for us to allow others to continue to manipulate us in their own self-interest as if it was still slavery time, when we know that it's all about economics, and we know that we're being used in that whole process, and we know that one of the greatest contributing factors still today is the irrational, make no sense, quote unquote, immigration laws in this country. And that is a platform that we ought to be speaking on with consistency. And I'm hoping that we can take your book as a launching pad to begin to document beyond a shadow of a doubt that it ain't about racism. It ain't about Black Lives Matter. It ain't about anything except the fact that we refuse to take advantage of this opportunity, which says very clearly that as long as you bring in all of these people and give them a work permit, they are going to step over us and keep on going, which means that we will stay at the bottom and we will come up with the excuse that it's all because they don't want us to advance. No, it's not. It's because we don't believe what's in your book. We don't dare to take what's in your book and challenge the system to do better. If we don't do that, then no one can complain about the future but us. And as we come out of this pandemic and we talk about workforce, and we talk about those who want to work and those who don't want to work, if you keep giving me stimulus checks, if you keep telling me that I can't go back to work because of the color of my skin, then the pandemic is not only going to kill us, but it will make us, quote unquote, unprepared to do anything else but be killed. So I hope that I can convince others that at the end of the day, there may be some racism, but the biggest thing I want to tackle is this immigration and how it's adversely impacting on the will to achieve and the ability for us to believe that it's about what we do, not about what they don't do.
I just have to say amen to that.
So you get ready to send me my books.
I will.
Sign them all so that I can give them out to the proper people with a similar kind of message and challenge them from Washington to the state's capital, to the city, to the county, to understand that as we come out of this pandemic, there's a new set of issues that we're going to have to deal with. And one of them is going to be the awesome impact that it's going to have on us as we prepare to try to go back to work. If I got millions of people who don't have a stimulus check, who now have permission to work in this great country called America, and that we're going to wait on our stimulus check, or we're going to believe that we don't need to go to school and get an education, because if we do, they're not going to give us a job, then the circumstances that we're dealing with now, today, would be worse than they've ever been. So your book lays the foundation, 200 years behind the 8 ball. Here's an opportunity. Here's the documentation, which says this is one of the solutions. And it would seem to me that those of us who know that this is true ought to become the voice and the advocate for others to believe that it is, and challenge them to do what they have to do in spite of what they think they cannot do. And if they don't do it, then it's time for us to think of another solution. Roy, it's always been good to be in your presence. And I want you to know that I've always enjoyed our conversation and would not be here now, but I feel bored because now I've got evidence the stuff that I believe has been documented, and
That's
nobody
big. That's a big
I
point,
make
isn't
it
it?
up. It ain't none of mine. It was an outside, unbiased voice that put it in writing. And if you don't believe what's in here, and if you don't want to change and act because of what's in here, then the worst is going to be worse than it is today. So I thank you for having done this. And I want to share it with my colleagues, with those who will listen to me, because I do believe, as I believed 30, 40 years ago, that at the end of the day, it ain't about what we don't do. It's the circumstances that they create, which says to us that no matter what you do, you're still going to be colored. This says that that's not the case. This says that there are some other issues that can be dealt with. And I think that we are prepared to deal with those. My brother, it's been good sharing with you. And I'm going to look forward to continuing this conversation. And I hope that time will permit for you to come down to Miami and break bread with me.
I was just thinking about that. I gotta break loose from here. The pandemic has kept me chained down, but I look forward to it. Thanks so much
Thank you.
for
Appreciate
all
it.
you said and done.